Hi everyone, today I'm going to take you through how to paint this underwater coral scene. There's a couple of different stages that you can stop at. So you can stop at the underwater scene, just the background. If you want to finish there, if you want to add the coral, you can. And then if you want to also add the last details of the fish, you can do that as well. So it's up to you. These are some of the paints I've been using lately. There are a few other colors in addition to these, which I will go through with you as we go through the painting. And these are the brushes that I use, usually varied sizes and shapes. That red one right at the top with the red handle is a really shabby soft bristled brush, but shabby, which is really good for doing some of the coral. And the two on the right are really important for blending. And the other ones in the middle are usually for backgrounds or for stippling. And then you're going to need 2 pots of water. No painter's tape today though. That way you can keep your brushes nice and clean as you paint. Okay, first step. I've gotten some aqua blue and I've gotten one of the larger brushes, probably not the largest brush that you saw in that sequence, but there was a bottom brush. My pet bird is making a cameo. He'll make a cameo for the first couple of minutes. He's sitting on my shoulder. So I've started with an aqua blue and I'm just doing short crisscross strokes across the middle of the canvas. They start to fade out at the bottom. And all I've done is dip my brush into water and then dabbed off the excess water and then dipped it into that aqua color. And when it's loaded up a little bit more, I start at the top and then fade it out to the bottom. Now I've picked up some white. I've washed my brush briefly, but I've left some of that aqua blue on there because it'll blend in nicely. Now remember, this is the background for water. So you do want it to look ripply and have some texture. So just big crisscross shapes, and you don't need to be too accurate with it because you do want it to look like underwater. Now I have some cobalt blue, which I don't think was at the beginning, in that shot at the beginning. This is cobalt blue. I want some shadowy parts of the ocean, which is usually what we see when we look underwater. And then I want some lighter bits. So that cobalt blue, and you'll see that I'm going up a bit higher on the sides because I kind of wanted that curved shape. And that curved shape, when I paint in the light source at the top, will also kind of follow that same shape. Right at the bottom, I have a dark, cool blue that I am using. And I haven't really washed my brush here because I want everything to blend in together. But I'm dipping my brush straight into that darkest blue and creating a cluster of shadows on the right-hand side and then fading it out a little bit and making it a little bit thinner towards the left. You don't want everything to look too uniform or too symmetrical. And I'm using the same brush for the background the whole way through. It's quite a large brush. It's a round brush. I wouldn't say it has super soft bristles, but it's good for this sort of sweeping blending background work. Now all I've done is grabbed a little bit of white, or more a lot of white, and a little bit of cobalt blue and mix those together, and that's going to be the lightest part at the top. The light source is coming from the top, so we want that part to be the lightest, and then we want towards the bottom to be darkest, and we just want to blend it all together. With acrylics, they do tend to dry quickly. If you make sure that your brush is wet, so wet your brush but then dab it off on a towel so that all the excess is gone, and you'll find that you'll be able to blend them in a little bit easier because you have that water and they don't dry as quickly. So I'm going in with a flat brush and just adding in a few more darker shades and then using that larger brush again to stipple them, and all I'm doing is tapping and flicking to get that look happening and just blending them in together. So we started with that aqua blue in the middle, straight across. Then we did some lighter parts at the top and the bottom, and then we started to add in our shadows. I usually start with my middle or medium colors and then go to light and then go to dark because it's a lot harder to take a dark color and make it lighter than it is to get a lighter color darker. And I've tried to keep on the right side, I've tried to keep some of that shadowing. Now, if you want to, I'm using a dry brush here. See how I'm just softening everything? If you want to keep those dramatic strokes and those dramatic lines from your larger brush, that still looks good. I just wanted to soften up some of it. And I'm not softening up all of it because I still want to see some of those streaks and some of that water. But this sort of just nicely blends everything in together and softens up some of those edges. And that's what I'm doing here. That's the first step for your background. Now what we need to do is create our light source. So I have a round brush here with a pointed tip, and I've dipped it in white and a tiny, tiny bit of cool yellow. And I'm starting to dab and tap and create that shape. It's that same sort of U shape that I tried to make with the color of the water. So I want that to follow. And that way it'll look all cohesive. I've started in the middle to make it almost like the source of the light of the sun, and then I've dabbed and tapped, and I've left some of that blue. You want it to be a little bit transparent because you don't get light shining through all of the water. You want to see a few bits of water. Now what I've done is grabbed a flat brush, and I'm just using white, nothing else. It is sort of mixing in a little bit with some of the wet paint, and it is slightly transparent so you can see through it, which is actually what we want. We want to be able to see those different ripples and waves and movement in the water. And all I'm doing is creating little strokes and little squiggles, loading up my brush, and you'll see towards the top of the light source, the lines are a bit thicker and I've used a bit more paint and they're a bit brighter. And now that I'm coming down closer to the water's depth and as it gets deeper, it starts to taper off and it fades, because we have most of that light coming from the top, and that's where your white will be strongest and thickest and brightest. Try not to overdo any of these strokes. Do a few different dabs. Sometimes I get caught up in what I'm doing and I'm dabbing and tapping, and then I don't take the time to step back, and you don't want to overdo it. So make sure you do a few little squiggles, dabs, taps, few little strokes, fades. Here I'm just softening up some of those edges, especially where the water becomes a little bit deeper. And to make those really light white bits, all you need to do is make sure that you wipe off as much white paint off your brush as you can before you apply it to the canvas, and that will create those fades. Now I showed the camera a turquoise color. It's just a turquoise color, and I'm using a round brush with a pointed tip, and I'm just starting to create a few shadows to go along with those highlights. We want to start to see the ripples in the waves and the water. So do a few ripples, do a few waves, whether you're using your white, you're doing your highlights, or doing these shadows with the turquoise, and then take a step back and look at your painting from a distance, and that'll kind of guide you and tell you if you need a few more on the left side, or if it's even, or if you feel like it's enough. You want to make sure you see a little bit of everything. You want to be able to see that beautiful background that we just did. You want to be able to see those lovely, beautiful white highlights. And then you also want to see some of these shadowy parts as well. Same technique, you'll see that they're towards the top of the canvas, those lines are a bit darker and stronger because they're closer to the light source. And then as the water gets deeper and further down, then they fade and they get a little bit smaller. Now I've taken my dark, cool blue that I used for those shadowy parts of the water, and I'm using a flat brush. And I have that flat brush on its side so that we have a nice sharp edge and we can make those lines. And I'm just sort of doing little squiggles to create more shadow. Now, most of those shadows, again, now because this is depth and these are deeper shadows of the waves or the ripples, the deeper we go into the ocean, the more we start to see them. So you'll notice that those waves or those ripples in the center of the canvas are a little bit darker, thicker and stronger. And then as we get closer to the surface or closer to the light source, they get smaller and they fade a little bit. I just wanted to make that shadow more prominent. See, as we get deeper, I am making them a little bit longer, a little bit thicker, a little bit darker. And I'm pulling all of the lines from the edges into the middle. So if you notice, if you have a look at those darker waves or ripples in the middle. They start on the edge and they curve down and they follow that same curve that I want for the rest of the water. I want everything to kind of be pulled into the center because we're going to have some coral in the center of it, and then we're going to put our fishes around it. So because that's the centerpiece, I want all those lines, I want eyes to be drawn to those lines following straight into the middle. I'm just going in with a little bit of white again, just to create some of those highlights in between some of those shadows. The two big tips I can give you with painting and color in general is that the more contrast you can create, your highlights and your depth are really what make your painting pop and really start to give it some of those beautiful details. So that's why I'm layering here, and I'm going over with some of the darker blue and creating those shadows and then contrasting it with some of the white. And towards the center, you'll notice that some of those white lines are really quite faded and look very wispy. All I've done is dip my brush in white paint, wipe off most of the white paint, and then drawn on a line, and then sometimes I use my finger to smudge it in just to give it that softer look. Now we're going to paint in the floor of the ocean, and to make this color I have mixed that aqua blue that we started with some white. Now these lines will be a little bit stronger and a little bit thicker, and I'm starting from the left side into my shadows so we get a nice contrast between those lines, and then pulling over to the left. Now you're going to have more of those lines on the right, just so that we can create an angle of the floor of the ocean that we want. And then they'll fade to the left. And at the back, as we get towards the horizon line, you can see me doing that now with that same flat brush. I haven't changed brushes just yet. Those lines are a little bit lighter and there's more of them as we get further back into that little horizon line. And then as we get to the bottom of the canvas and closer to us, those light blue lines have a bigger gap between them, and they're a little bit thicker and they're a little bit brighter. I've dipped my flat brush into some black and some blue, so that very dark cool blue that we've used for those shadows, and I've added in some black. And now I'm just creating a little bit of definition on the horizon line. I'm using my flat brush here, so not that larger brush that we used for the background, or not the round brush with the pointed tip, but that flat brush. Those sharp lines that you can see on the left side of the canvas is me holding the brush horizontally and creating those nice sharp lines. The wonderful thing with a flat brush is that you can create those sharp lines, or if you turn it so that it's vertical, then you can start to create those bigger brush strokes that you can see where I've created that shadow on the horizon line. And now in between those light stripes or those white lines or those light blue lines that we've done at the bottom, I'm just creating some shadow. If we create that contrast, the light blue lines will pop a little bit more, but I'm still trying to keep the depth of that blue and all of the shading that we did and the fading that we did in the beginning. Just smoothing out some of the horizon here so it all blends in nicely together, and going over some of those dark lines with some of the aqua blue to make it look like they're glowing a little bit, and just to soften up how dark it is. Putting in some of that aqua blue. That aqua blue makes everything look like it's glowing. And in between that dark blue, it also helps to make that dark blue a little bit more prominent. Also looks quite nice with our shadowing as well. There is a lot of layering in this background just to give it that texture. Those last few dabs and taps that I'm doing now are a tiny bit of that turquoise green, tiny bit of the dark blue and black, and then a little bit of the white, just to bring it all together. I wanted a little bit more shadow on the left side. I felt like it needed just something a little bit more to create definition. This is one of my favorite techniques. just wet a toothbrush just a little bit, wipe off the excess water, dip it straight into the white paint, and then use your finger to flick. And that's all I've done. And there were some splatters there that I thought were a little bit too big or too stripy. So all I've done is grabbed a tissue and blended them in. Now we're going to paint in some sun rays or some light rays. I'm using my flat brush again vertically so it creates a nice sharp line. I started in the middle and went straight down, and now I am fanning out so that we have different little rays of light. And again, I am doing a couple of those rays of light and then stepping back and seeing where we need some more. And the biggest tip I can give you for this is less is more. So put a little bit of white paint on your brush, but wipe off as much of it as you can, and then apply it to your canvas, because if there's not quite enough white, it's easy to add more. But if you put too much paint, then you've sort of created a thick white line that is a little bit it's just trickier to take off. If you have wet wipes at home, you can use those as long as your background is dry. If you wanted to if you did something that was too thick and you wanted to wipe it off, you can. I do that quite often if I need to. And you start at the top of the light source because that's where the light would be strongest, and then flick downwards because that's what creates that fade and that point at the end of each one of the sun rays or the light rays. We will go over some of that with the coral, and then right at the end when we do our details, we'll add it back in. Now I'm just grabbing I had my flat brush with white, and right up the top I added just pure white now that the canvas was dry, just to make that light source really bright and make that the centerpiece of the top. And now what I'm doing is same flat brush, I have mixed the dark cool blue and black, more black than blue, and I am creating the backdrop and the shadows. I'm blocking in where I would like the coral to go. If you wanted to stop just at those last rays of light and just have a beautiful underwater scene to look at, you can do that. If you want to, this is sort of the second stage of the painting, so if you wanted to add this in, you absolutely can. Or you can let it dry and think about it and come back to it later. I'm using my flat brush and I'm just sort of dabbing and tapping. I'm using it horizontally so we can get those nice big broad brush strokes. Dabbing and tapping, and you can see some of the blue behind it, which I don't think is a bad thing because it creates that depth and it gives it a bit of texture rather than just one big block color. I'm just creating the shadows and shapes. These will become our shadows, and this is what's going to give our coral depth. You can shape your coral however you like. I think it's nice here because there's a big base at the bottom, and then it goes to a peak. Just underneath, I have I'm using a smaller flat brush here and just dipping my paint in white, nothing else. Not too much paint, and creating some highlights around the bottom. Starting as close to the shadow of the coral as I can, and then flicking down, because when you load up your brush, you'll have the most paint on it. You want to use that paint closest to where you want it to be brightest, and then you can see there how I'm sort of fading it out. So same thing, again, dip your brush in. Don't use too much paint because you can always add more. It's a little bit easier to add more paint. So now I've finished my backdrop and my highlights underneath the coral. Now I'm using that same small flat brush that I just did the white highlights with. I have a sort of dark cool green and mixed it with a little bit of yellow. And this is my base. So the green is going to be most vibrant at the top. You can see me layering it there. It's going to be brightest at the top because it's closest to the light. We will go back over that. It's just nice to sometimes let your work dry, because then when you put another layer over it, it's nice and dry and it doesn't blend in too much together. Now I'm going over it with yellow. This is just cool yellow, not neon. We will get to our neons. I love my neons and my fluorescent paints. That red that I've just done, I've used a round brush Now with Movie Magic, I did forget to press record here. That's my confession, but I'm going to tell you exactly what I did. So I have a round brush there, and I've dipped it into that green turquoise color that we used for those shadows, and I've squished it sort of so it looks like a fan, and then I've dabbed to create that green down the bottom. And this is my shabby brush, my very shabby brush, dipping it straight into neon orange and then just dabbing and tapping. Now the trick here is, again, to try and keep some of your depth. See, I've grabbed that round brush again, dipping it into neon yellow. I'm sort of squishing it with my thumb to make it like a fan, and I'm doing the highlights. So it's the exact same technique that I used to get that green underneath. We just did a little bit more of the green, and then we've got the highlights on top. Now the key here again is try not to overdo it. You want to keep the darkness is just as important as the highlights. And when you can see both, that is when your painting really starts to pop. Now I have a small round brush that has a pointed tip, and all I've done is dip my brush in white, nothing else, just white, and I'm using little flicks. So applying more pressure at the base and then flicking up and releasing that pressure. And that creates that little furry effect, and just short, sharp little flicks. It's exactly what I did the first time round. Actually, it's quite nice, I think, that I'm layering it again, because we'll get more vibrancy when we put the neons over it. This is a tip for neon paint. This will not stay white. If you are using neon or fluorescent, if you want them to be really bright, they should have a base of white underneath them, and that's why I am painting white here. So that one on the right, same brush, I'm using the same brush, just slightly different techniques. So it's either dabbing and tapping or flicking. And then once that dries, we'll go over that with our neons, and it'll look really beautiful. I'm using neon green here now for the highlights of that little grassy area. And just using little flicks to make it look like it's sort of dropping down. And then little squiggles at the bottom to give that illusion of movement, making it look like it's growing downwards. Illusion of movement in the ripples of the water. Same brush. It's a small round brush with a pointed tip. Now for this I'm using red and a little bit of neon orange. You can see me dipping my my brush in now. Now for underneath, on the top it's red and a little bit of neon orange. Underneath to that red color, I have added burnt umber, which I don't think was at the beginning of the video. But burnt umber is kind of like a dark brown. So everything on the top needs to be brighter because it's closest to the light source. So the closer it is to the light source, the brighter it is and the more vibrant it is. And you can see how I've faded those colors into that depth, but I've made sure that I've kept some of that background that we first did. It's really important to keep that depth. So bright and highlighted on the top, and then a little bit darker. Now I'm using my neons, my neon yellow going over it. You can see how bright it is now. You just don't get that same effect. You just don't get that same effect if we were to go straight on that dark color. We want it to be nice and vibrant. I will create some shadowing in that later on. It does look beautiful as it is, but it is always nice to have a bit of light and shade. And like I said, the darkness of a piece is just as important as those highlights. It's what brings the painting to life and creates those little details. If you have a look at the orange coral in the bottom left-hand side of our little cluster, you can see that I have dabbed and tapped so that some of it's very bright, and then we've still got some of that depth. So try to make sure that you keep that. Try not to overdo it. I know it's difficult because it's so much fun when you're dabbing and tapping and using your brushes, but just try and be cautious that you don't overdo it, and those shadows and those highlights will look beautiful. This color, all I'm doing is using neon pink, just neon pink, not mixed with anything, and it's going straight over that white, so it looks really beautiful. I have left some of the white, so you don't have to be super careful about making sure that you cover up all of the white. The white just gives it more highlights, which I think is really nice. And I'm just, these flicks are longer. So my brush stroke again, starting with pressure right at the bottom, loading up my brush, putting a lot of pressure and then flicking straight up. But the flicks are a little bit longer so that the coral looks longer. The pieces of coral look longer. And just a few little highlights in that depth. I'm using that turquoise color. That turquoise color that I showed you before. Small pointed flat round brush again. This one is my shabby brush. This is also what I use for clouds when I paint clouds. Most of my shabby brush, I'm dipping it in neon green and creating some highlights. Now I've gone back to my round pointed brush and I'm using violet, and I've mixed some of that darker violet in with white to create a lighter color. Same technique. I wanted this one to look a little bit more fluffy rather than spiky or pointed like some of those other ones, to just give it a bit of a different texture. But it should be darker at the bottom, so I'm using that dark violet at the bottom and then fading it up into that lighter purple color. Creating a few little lines and strokes of some shadows with that violet. A few little extra details. Now I'm going into, now that that's dried a little bit, I am using a cool yellow and also a little bit of that burnt umber that I talked about before, and just creating a few shadows and a little bit of depth. Even though that neon yellow was beautiful as it was, it is always nice to have a little bit of light and dark and some shadows in there. It just breaks it up a little bit so it doesn't look like one uniform matte color. And again, load your brush up, do a few little dabs, take a step back, think about where it might need a few more shadows. Make sure you leave lots of that beautiful neon yellow there because that's gorgeous. We want that to stay. Now I'm just again using neon yellow and dotting some highlights on our top piece of coral. Now we don't want the dots to stay like that. We don't want big dots because it doesn't look quite as realistic. So I've started with those big dots and then I've gone over them again and just sort of blended them in. We want some definition, but not too much, not just big blobs of yellow. So it starts out a little bit blobby and then I blend them in a little bit. Same technique. So the top will be, because it's closest to the light source, the top will be the brightest, and then it fades down a little bit until we get to our dark blue-black color. And I try to make sure that I leave some of the green and some of those undertones as well. Just going over, that is neon green mixed with a little bit of white. I wanted there to be a little bit more definition on that. And I'm grabbing my little shabby cloud brush and again squishing it between my thumb and my forefinger to make it into what looks more like a fan. And I am using some of that aqua blue that we used that we first used, the very first step that we did, just to tie it all in with the colors of the water surrounding it. And on the top of that coral on the left that you just saw me dabbing, all I did was use cool yellow, not neon yellow, just cool yellow. I think it complements the reddy orange underneath a little bit better. And just going over, I just wanted to make those a bit brighter, just going over the tips of that coral with neon pink. And once it dries, when you layer it again, you'll find it will be a little bit more vibrant. Now we are drawing in some fishies. To create that color, I have used neon green and that turquoise color. And it doesn't matter if your fishes are a little bit transparent. I think that looks nice. It looks like it really complements that they're part of the ocean and part of the sea. So the first two I've done, I've made them like almost like the shape of an eye and then flicked the little tails. This last one, I want the body to be turning. So I've done that shape. It's almost like an almond shape or the shape of an eye or a football. And then the last fish I did a twist at the end. So it looks like the fish is turning. We don't want them all to be exactly the same. So we'll do this as a base and I'm just layering it so that the green color is nice and vibrant. So a bit of turquoise, little bit of neon green, not a lot. Mostly that light green turquoise color. Now I've got a small round brush with a pointed tip, and I'm using red, just cool red, and drawing in the silhouettes of a couple of smaller fish. They might be smaller or maybe in the distance. While I'm letting my other fishes dry. When they dry, then I can apply the paint a little bit easier. And I'm also using that dark cool blue to make other silhouettes of fish, almost like they're in the background. They're so far in the background that they look like they're part of the ocean. If you don't want to do this last step with the fish, that's totally okay. If you want to just leave your coral, that's fine. If you want to do all of the steps, you can definitely keep going. I'm using neon yellow again. Putting highlights at the top of the fish because the light rays are shining on the top of them. We want to make them look like they're glowing a little bit, beautiful tropical fish glowing. Brightest at the top and then fading in a little bit. A few highlights on their tails, again at the top of their tail, mostly at the top of their tails because that's where the light's hitting. Now I've dipped my brush into that black-blue color, so mostly black but also blue, and created some stripes on them, adding in some eyes. And a little bit of shadow around the fish that will really make the contrast. There will be shadows and then there will be the vibrant color of the fish. Make them stand out that little bit more, give them a bit more definition. And you'll notice the way that I've curved the lines. So the first fish on the left, furthest on the left, I've curved the line to the right. And then with the fish at the bottom, because it's facing a different way, I've curved to the left. So just keep that in mind. It makes them look like they're at different angles. Just using my black-blue to create some shadows underneath them, just to make them stand out that little bit more. Few last little details. I wanted to make that last piece of coral that same aqua blue. And now we need to add back in our rays of light. So it's good that we did them at the beginning because now we have a line to follow. And by now, most of the paint should be dry. Instead of using my flat brush, I'm using a round brush with a pointed tip to give them a little bit more definition. And you can see how I'm trying to put on very little white paint. So it's transparent. You can still sort of see some of the coral behind it or the water behind it. And then I'm using my finger. If I feel like it's a little bit too too vibrant, I will go over it with my finger and just sort of rub it in. Remember, you can always add more white, but sometimes it's a little bit tricky when you add a big blob of white and then trying to take it off. Last but not least, a few more white highlights to really make that coral stand out and give it some definition. Just using my flat brush. Now I'm using my round brush with a pointed tip. Now I'm using my finger to smudge some of these so that they fade and look really beautiful, like the movement of the water. You'll notice that some of them I do keep as lines, and then some of them I use my finger to fade. And that's it. There we have it. All completed, all done. I hope you painted this one with me. If you have, please contact me on social media and show me. If not, thank you so much for watching. And don't forget to subscribe because there's lots more painting tutorials coming. Hope you enjoyed this one. See you next time.